Good morning. I'm Representative John McGinnis, 79th District, Blair County. I want to thank my colleagues on the stage with me today, Representative Rapp, Representative Truitt, Representative Schemmel, Representative Keller, and Representative Metcalf, the chair of the State Government Committee. I want to address the single greatest financial crisis in the history of the Commonwealth. It is not just another political problem, as we are on a path to divest the future of Pennsylvania. Just the interest on the pension debt is over $4 billion per year right now and growing. That's equal to the annual salaries and benefits for more than 50,000 teachers who sometime soon may be displaced by this unsustainable blob. The market value of the unfunded liabilities of our state pensions is over $100 billion, nearly $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in the state. A family of four that leaves Pennsylvania immediately gets $40,000 of debt forgiveness, where a family of four that moves into the state immediately gets $40,000 of debt on their shoulders for a service they never received. Guess which way the migration is going to go? The pension crisis is making young people Pennsylvania's #1 export. On September 25th last year, Standard & Poor's handed the Keystone State its third credit downgrade in 3 months. This was 2 days after Fitch had lowered Pennsylvania's credit rating. It was 2 months after Moody's had done the same. Only 3 states are rated worse by Standard & Poor's, only 2 by Moody's. I and 253 other people are fiduciaries to the citizens of Pennsylvania, and we are failing in our position of trust. As bad as the short-run consequences are, the long-term issues will be worse if we do not honestly address the problem. The long-term problems can be illustrated by that old ditty, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree." The man behind the tree is today's kids and generations not yet born. We have a moral imperative to stop the ongoing intergenerational theft. The root of the problem is that defined benefit retirement plans and politics are a toxic mix. In 2001, Act 9 made dramatic increases for an already overly generous retirement plan. Act 38 in 2002 granted an ad hoc COLA. In 2003, through Act 40, the legislature committed to a 10-year plan of underfunding the pensions. And in 2010, Act 120 made that underfunding significantly worse. Elected officials reap high political return by distributing benefits and avoid negative political return by not paying for them. Fixing the plan design is simple, but it will apply to new employees only. The 2014 Blue Ribbon Panel on Public Pension Funding, commissioned by the Society of Actuaries, concluded that a retirement plan should include adequate funding, intergenerational equity, and cost stability and predictability. These are essential features of a defined contribution plan where the employer pays no more than 4% to 7% of salary into an employee's retirement account. I will be supporting legislation that offers all new employees a defined contribution plan with a 5% match of salary. One of the things that inhibits dealing with this issue effectively is that we lack complete reporting. A market value balance sheet would reflect the economic impact of pensions involving all stakeholders, including and especially taxpayers. I will be introducing legislation to require that CSRS and PSRS include a market value balance sheet in their comprehensive annual financial reports. And it will follow the recommendation by the Blue Ribbon Panel in calculating the market value of liabilities by using the risk-free rate of return. Slide 8 reports the combined unfunded liabilities of CSRS and PSRS according to the 3 different valuations. All 3 valuations use market value of assets. The $55 billion figure, which is what CSRS and PSRS reports, discounts liabilities at 7.5%, an interest rate that is at odds with both economic and legal realities. The middle value of nearly $116 billion is a lower bound to the actual economic burden borne by the taxpayers. The higher number of almost $149 billion is an upper bound. We are now at the key point of this talk. How did all that underfunding happen, and how do we deal with the massive problem that exists? To understand the decade-long policy of underfunding, we need to be clear on two terms. First, the actuarial recommended contribution, or ARC, which is the annual amount necessary to cover benefits currently earned, as well as pay off previously earned benefits as yet funded. And the unfunded accumulated liability, or UAL, which is the amount of additional investment needed today to cover benefits already earned. The UAL is not, as some say, a projection that kicks in only in the circumstance where the entire workforce suddenly retires. The unfunded liability represents a real and present debt that is growing at 7.5% annually, irrespective of current and future employment. Now, let's try to understand the funding problem through a multiple choice question. How much should be invested today to cover a benefit of $1,000 in 15 years? Well, to guarantee that benefit today, it will cost $705.80 in the purchase of 15-year U.S. Treasury strips. If we simply assume a 7.5% return per year, we only have to invest $337.97. Now, if we assume the 7.5% return and also pretend that the bill is not due for 30 years instead of 15, then we need to just put in $114.22. And finally, if that $114.22 seems too hard a price to pay, we'll just legislate less. Now, choice A would be the approach that would keep future taxpayers entirely off the hook. Choice B would be the approach of the blue ribbon panel, recognizing investment risk to fully cover pension benefit when it is due. Choice C combines investment risk with a delusion that the benefit is not payable for 30 years. That is effectively how the ARC is calculated for CSRS and PSRS. And choice D, which says that even with risk and delusion, the ARC is still too expensive. That has been the de facto policy of our state government since 2004. As you look at the funding history on slide 11, keep in mind that the ARC, which we are not meeting, is arbitrarily low, partly because of the 7.5% assumption, but mostly because of the willful delusion that the benefits earned will be received long after they are actually due. The ARC is calculated with a 30-year amortization period, while the average employee will actually be retiring in 15 to 20 years. The Pew Foundation reports that we are in a race to the bottom in properly funding our pensions, 49th out of 50 states, with only New Jersey worse. And this puts the lie to the claim that we've passed any balanced budget since 2004. When you increase pension debt because of failure to properly fund pensions, you do not have a balanced budget. This comment by actuary and Manhattan Institute scholar Richard Dreyfuss is right on the mark. Pennsylvania continues to contribute 100% of a deficient rate, somehow believing that this is a responsible financial practice. Now, the first and most important question for any honest pension reform plan is WTF? Where's the funding? The key recommendation of the Blue Ribbon Panel is that the unfunded accrued liability should be amortized with level funding over no more than 20 years. We must commit to a funding schedule that will immediately begin to reduce the unfunded liabilities of CSRS and PSRS and zero them out by 2035. What will this commitment cost? Currently, the state and school districts are paying about 22% of payroll into pensions. This will have to increase to about 35% next year, a contribution increase of $3 billion that would be level for 20 years. This is an uncomfortably high cost, but the debt is compounding at more than $4 billion per year. Surely it's a difficult lift, but it will only get more difficult. If it's too hard to increase school class sizes by 4 or 5 students now, how will it be any easier in 10 years to increase them by 15 to 20 students? If it's too hard to pay off the debt now, how will it be easier in 10 years when it's compounding at 7.5% per year? Now, we are hearing voices that we just need to let Act 120 work. Well, Act 120 may be the most inapt solution ever proposed. Its logic was that the best way to deal with a $30 billion debt problem is to grow that debt to $65 billion. Then it will become manageable. Seriously. The combined unfunded actuarial accrued liabilities of CSRS and PSRS are up more than 80% since 2010 when Act 120 was passed. And this is with investment returns above 9% per year. What happens when we hit a bear market and we're overdue? Some are working on sophisticated plan designs for new employees. Short of a miracle, there is no design that will solve the underfunding problem. Regardless of what happens to new employees, the pension debt currently in place has to be paid off or it will wreck the future of Pennsylvania. Complexity is the enemy of risk management plans, and plans with complex and arcane features are at best distractions and probably worse. Take pension obligation bonds as an example. They would essentially force taxpayers to co-sign for a loan for someone who has already proven himself financially irresponsible. Yet this ideas and others are being pushed because of unwillingness to address the real problem honestly. In 1980, the S&L industry was collectively in the red $2 billion. Under Presidents Carter and Reagan, a plan was adopted to help them grow out of that debt. By the end of the decade, the $2 billion problem had become a $200 billion problem because of reckless behavior motivated by the aim of avoid paying the bill. Now, one of the things we face with such high pension debt is the incentive to behave recklessly. Beware. Elected officials have and will come up with every gimmick possible not to pay the bill. The worst enacted idea so far was Act 120. It got bipartisan support because its underlying goal was to contribute less money into already underfunded plans. The massive attention given to design, while the financial markets tell us it's a contribution problem, is yet another example. When we understand that moral hazard is a lack of prudent behavior because cost and risk of that behavior fall on someone else, then 3 other examples relate to our unfunded liability. One, although both CSRS and PSRS are legally bound by the prudent investor principle, they have 35 to 40% of their assets in the highest, most illiquid risk classes. Since they are supposed to be funding retired senior citizens on fixed incomes, it is incongruous that such asset allocation is in line with prudent investing, and the downside of this risk is severe. A second case of moral hazard is that CSRS and PSRS incur extraordinary costs chasing high returns. In 2006, when the pension funds together had $90 billion of assets, they incurred $500 million in fees. 7 years later, with $14 billion less in assets, they were paying out nearly $250 million more in fees, from 57 basis points in 2006 to 96 basis points in 2013. When a company like Vanguard would manage these assets more efficiently, more transparently, with less risk, and at 2 basis points, well, we could be saving $700 million a year in fees and have better management at the same time. A third example of moral hazard is the call to lower the school district's share of pension costs. School districts make nearly all the payroll decisions that impact the PSRS pension liabilities, but they bear on average only 44% of the cost. That fraction needs to be higher, not lower. Honest pension reform begins and mostly ends with following the Blue Ribbon Panel's recommendation to amortize the unfunded liabilities over no more than 20 years. Every other proposal is ineffective without this one. We should indeed put all new employees into a defined contribution plan with a 5% employer match. This is adequate, equitable, and predictable, and will eventually eliminate the moral hazard of defined benefit plans. We should also require a market value balance sheet that reports the true economic burden borne by taxpayers. We should adopt a passive investment strategy and outsource investment management to low-fee index funds. And finally, we should avoid the too clever by half proposals, such as restricted funds, pension obligation bonds, buybacks, buckets, and hybrid plans. Let me conclude that honest pension reform follows the imperative articulated by Thomas Jefferson nearly 2 centuries ago. We shall all consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debt and morally bound to pay them ourselves. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
So just maybe specifically, could you comment on what the governor proposed yesterday and how that jives with what you're saying?
Well, I think he got 1 or 2 things right. Let's start with the governor has recognized there's a pension problem. That's good. That's new. He also said that these fees that are being paid to the active managers can be obviated by this proposal that I'm suggesting, that we go to a third-party index fund to manage the assets. But looking through his budget in brief and listening to him yesterday, I still don't think he gets it. I think he's in the mode where legislators were in 2010, and they're looking for any way to avoid proper funding of the pensions. And he's got a pension obligation bond, he's got a restricted fund in this. He says he's going to save $10 billion, and I have to look at the details of that, but I suspect he has an arbitrage in mind that he's going to borrow at 3.5 and earn 7.5, and trust me, that's not going to work. We've already proven that government has no expertise when it comes to investment. So, like I said, I'm glad he admits there's a problem. But his comments to me strike me as fundamentally in the wrong spirit. And I got to thinking about this today. And this is the colossal irony. The governor showed yesterday that he's the biggest of big spenders. I am probably, excuse me, Darrell, I am probably the most fiscally conservative person in the legislature. And yet I'm saying, throw money at the problem. That'll solve it. That's and the governor is saying, no, we need that money somewhere else. But the problem is jeopardizing our future. And it needs to be addressed sooner, not later. Yes?
Well, Jenny.
I was just wondering, you're saying that school districts need to up their share. And at the same time, yesterday we heard, both Republicans, caucuses in the House and Senate say they're not going for the governor's tax increases. Where is that money supposed to come from?
Well, let me say, I hope this addresses your question, but the governor put something else out there yesterday that, again, as an economist, I have to comment on. He says we need more spending in education, we need lower property taxes, and we need to fix the pension problem. Now, I don't care which one of those you pick, but the other two are off the table when you pick one. If you want to address the pension problem, it's going to cost big time. And you can take property tax relief and you can take more spending for schools off the table. If you want more spending for schools, then you got to keep the property tax in play and you got to forget about the pensions. But the pension problem is the one that needs to be addressed because that has the biggest impact on our future. And think of the irony here. Again, another irony. They multiply. But what is education about except alerting our students about the future and the opportunities that the future holds? And our pension debt is killing those opportunities. We've got to move on it. It's imperative. Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I was just going to ask you to follow up on Jen's question. I mean, the revenues are what they are, and without, I mean, I can't imagine anybody sitting up there is going to call for a tax increase to pay for these, you know.
Let me just be sure. Anybody calling for a tax increase? No, we're unified on this point.
Right. So, I mean, what reform opportunities are out there to pay for a $50 billion unfunded liability? I mean, even if you sold all the state liquor stores, we're only talking about $1 billion up front. It doesn't seem like.
Let me give you my perspective, all right? And keep in mind the following. I come at this from a constitutional perspective because these defined benefit plans, the governor's right, are constitutionally protected, but if the benefits are protected, the funding should be protected too. And defined benefit plans require pre-funding, not post-funding. I come at this from a moral point of view because we do not want to saddle future generations for the price of our services today. And I come at this from an economic perspective because I see which way the migration is going right now. I mean, Pennsylvania just made the top 10 list of the national movers list of most out migrations. So we've got a constitutional argument here, we've got a moral argument, we've got an economic. Now, when you take that trinity up against the political arguments, I gotta say, I'm out of my element. But here's how I would solve it budgetarily. All right. Step one, commit to paying the bill. Step two, we'll have that fight. Is it going to be redirecting current revenues, or is it going to be having new revenues, or is it going to be a combination? And I and the folks up here want to assure you, we're not for new revenues. You know, $29, $30 billion is enough coming out of the pockets of Pennsylvania taxpayers. And we can redirect money. We can eliminate things. You know, there's a lot of subsidies out there for corporations. McGinnis lemma kicks in. If it's viable, it doesn't need a subsidy. If it needs a subsidy, it's not viable. Let's not waste that money in DCED. There's a lot of farm subsidy. There's energy. The government is proposing more green stuff. All that stuff needs to be zeroed out, and we can move those dollars. I mean, if the governor's willing to zero out research and costs for sickle cell anemia, why is he worrying about windmills? So again, I think there's ample room in the budget to get that extra $3 billion next year from this year, and the school districts will share in that. My back of the envelope calculation said that the school districts, if they share the proper burden next year, are looking at non-pension costs going down about 5%. Now, nobody likes that. Everybody always likes the spending to go up. But 5% to get a grip on this problem now, when it will never be more manageable, as awful as it is, 5% cut now in your non-pension expenses gets us where we need to be next year. And then it becomes easier every year because it's level funded. It becomes easier. And we've rescued a good portion of our future that we're squandering now. Yes, ma'am.
You actually answered my question.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you could, just in simple terms that people can understand, explain the dangers that you see of the state going the pension obligations bond route. Well,
the dangers are actually several here. And first, the idea that you're going to borrow at a low rate, say 3.5%, 4%, and make some sort of profit because the pension debt itself is statutorily set at 7.5%. Well, that seems appealing. But let's think back. Pension obligation bonds are actually taxable. They're not municipal bonds. So that 3.5 or 4 points rate is going to be much closer to 7.5 once we factor in taxes. So the margin there of getting some sort of return on obligation bonds seems to me unlikely, or at least risky. Second problem is the assets might not perform. The worst problem, and this gets us back to the moral hazard theme that I was talking earlier. When you start borrowing money, suddenly people say, well, we don't have a need to fund the pensions properly. We've got plenty of money. We just borrowed $3 billion or $6 billion. And by the way, think of the scale here. The governor's proposing to borrow $3 billion, and he wants to save $10 billion, and we have a $55 billion problem. What are we going to do with the rest of that problem? I mean, even under the best circumstances, if the governor is right on all of this, we've still got well over $40 billion to worry about. So again, the pension obligation bonds, I like how I said it in my talk. It's forcing taxpayers to co-sign a loan for someone who's already proven himself financially irresponsible. Yes, sir. Senator Wagner.
How are you? Sorry I was late. I had an appointment. And I missed the first 15 minutes, but we've all been talking, and I'm from the private sector, and I just want to, and with the people in the audience that are here, I mean, in a real world, if we were just to set a date and we were to say January 1st of next year, everyone goes into a 401k program, and we stop the pension. Your pension, it's like you're changing jobs. You're leaving the state and you're going to work for Exxon down the street, and they have a 401k. Is this and again, there's a lot of stuff up here, and I'm involved in a lot right now, so I may have to get caught up. Is this a plan that you're looking at right now, that we've got to cut this thing off?
But that plan does not address the problem, and that's what I want to be clear about. If we put all new employees into a DC plan, and we should, and if we could even put current employees into a DC plan going forward, we should. But none of that affects the blob. These benefits have already been earned, and they're unfunded to the tune of over $100 billion if you do this analysis economically, and that's a big number. And what we do with new employees and what we do tomorrow has no impact on that number.
I have that, but I'm talking about, to stop to change the program. Does that, I mean, I'm asking you, does that...
Well, absolutely, we should do that. Absolutely. We need to, again, the genesis of this unfunded liability is the defined benefit program. When you put that together with politicians, they always have incentive to expand benefits, and they never have incentive to pay for them. And if we get to a DC plan, or what people call a 401k plan, all that goes away. All that problem goes away. And we fund 100% every paycheck.
So you and I have had conversations, and I think I believe you're 100 million more than I believe the
100 billion, but yes.
100 billion. I believe you more than I believe the lower amounts. And in the governor's budget address yesterday, he talked first time I've heard it publicly about the management fees paid by the pensions. So that maybe gives us optimism that maybe there'll be some changes there. And the other thing I want to point out that, and you and I have had conversation, that I think that the PSERS and SERS performance numbers have lagged by probably 2 to 3 points easily over the traditional market, the S&P, and 1% is worth 170 billion is worth 700 million if my math is correct.
Yes, but here's the thing about comparing PSERS returns with the index funds, and they have publications that say they're beating the index funds, and I'm skeptical of that. But the reason we can't compare this, we're comparing apples and oranges. We don't know how much risk PSERS and SERS has. When you have a portfolio, it's not just important to know what the return is, it's important to know how much risk, how much downside potential is there as well. And for an index fund, you know exactly what that is. But PSERS statements are not forthcoming. They don't have any measure of beta, which I'm talking about typical professional standards of risk measurement from finance. They don't have a beta, they don't posit an alpha. I haven't even found a standard deviation, which is the most common of all measures of risk. There's no Sharpe ratio, no Trainer ratio, no M-squared calculation. So I don't know whether they're on a risk-adjusted basis doing better than the index, but I would bet they're not. By the way, the governor said that yesterday, and I was happy to hear him say that. And Senators Eichelberger and Senator Rafferty and myself sent out a press release Monday calling for the outsourcing of the investment management, and Warren Buffett, same day, said the same thing. Now, I'm not saying Warren Buffett was reading our press release, but I'm just saying that's good company to be in.
Thank you for having the press conference this morning, and I think educating us all. And
Thanks, Senator.
I'm optimistic that the House realizes they have an expert on board. So
We'll see. We'll see. Anybody else? Thank you so much. Appreciate everybody's attendance today.